Defence Minister Maurice Payne has announced that Australia's bombing campaign against Islamic State targets in Iraq and Syria will end.
The Minister described the three-year campaign as arduous and brutal. To discuss the impact of Australia's role in the fight against Islamic State, we're joined by Professor John Blaxland, Head of the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at ANU. John, welcome.
Andrew, thanks for having me on the program.
So this marks the end of Australia's airstrike operations in Iraq and Syria. How successful has it been?
Oh, well, remarkably successful. Actually, this has been something the Royal Australian Air Force and the ADF in general can be quite proud of. The remarkable ability to sustain operations over a very long distance. They were operating out of Al Minhad Air Base in the United Arab Emirates, operating with refuelers, really demonstrating the high-end capability that is actually very good for the Defence Force. Our F-18s and the Hornets that were flying up there were providing precision munition strikes, more often than not actually employing their weapons because of the very strict rules of engagement. That meant that they only fired on targets where they had strong corroboration that it was a genuine target, and we're seeing the fruits of that. So as many people predicted a couple of years ago, and myself included, this would take a couple of years to pull off. They have pulled it off. But now, of course, the Defence Minister, I think, has made the good call of saying enough for the fighter aircraft, they can come home. The task is essentially finished, and now we need to weigh up what we do next. And of course, that's very much linked to what is actually happening in Iraq and Syria. And of course, we've got nearly 300 troops in Afghanistan as well. So we've got a footprint in the Middle East that includes troops in the United Arab Emirates providing a support base, troops in Iraq, troops in Afghanistan, and in Iraq they're still conducting this training, advising and assisting to the conventional forces. Considerable work still with the counter-terrorism forces, the special forces of Iraq, and then some support elements as well in there, working with the Kiwis in particular, and force protection elements.
So this involved 6 Super Hornet strike aircraft. Was this more than just a token contribution?
Look, 6 aircraft is not a token contribution when you're conducting the kind of operations that the Super Hornets were able to conduct. There's no question. My criticism has been that Australia needs to focus on its neighbourhood, on priorities in its neighbourhood, on engaging in its neighbourhood, and the operational tempo in the Middle East has actually reduced our ability to engage constructively in activities with our neighbours and building ties there. Now, that's a balancing act, and we're seeing already a bit of a pivot back to Asia, if you like, for the Australian Defence Force.
Sorry, John, you're saying our resources are stretched too far then, given our contribution in the Middle East?
Look, we have a boutique Defence Force. It's extremely good, but it's small. We do not have the ability or the luxury to sustain high-tempo operations in multiple locations. But there is, I acknowledge, there's real benefits for the Air Force from having conducted the operations. We now have an Air Force that is honed, that is equipped with the latest technology, that is interoperable, that has the best equipment and the most sophisticated capability and honed, refined aircraft skills in terms of support and flying those aircraft. So that's, in one sense, that's really good for the Air Force. The question is now how much additional benefit will accrue from maintaining things. Now, the government's decided, look, on the balance, it's better to bring them home because there's no requirement for them to do that. Now, interestingly enough, the Iraqi government never allowed them to be based in Iraq. So they had to fly all the way from the United Arab Emirates to get to northern Iraq and into Syria. So this is, a permissive environment in one sense, but the Iraqi government's been pretty, unwilling to really demonstrate how much they want us there. So in light of the Iraqi government's reluctance to really embrace Australia's contribution that way, I think it's totally appropriate. And of course, the other side to this equation is that Iraq's actions are actually sympathetic to Iran's actions, and that's where, Australia's interests need to be measured carefully. And so where we go to from here, we need to be mindful of the ramifications in the neighbourhood. We clearly don't want the situation in Iraq to unravel. We want to stabilise that and help consolidate that. But my sense is we can do that more remotely. We can do that more with help from bringing people to Australia to do training in Australia and so on.
Yeah, certainly Australia's involvement as far as those 6 strike aircraft were concerned hinged on the fight against Islamic State. We saw their stronghold Raqqa fall. Iraq's Prime Minister declared that there was victory in the war against Islamic State. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, it is a fair assessment insofar as it goes. But we now are in a precarious situation. The government of Iraq needs to deliver on consolidation, on reconstruction, on restitution. That's not something the ADF can do. What it can do, though, is help leaven the resolve and the perspective of the senior and middle management of the Iraqi armed forces with mentoring, with training, and helping them to understand the ramifications. That's something I think we can do remotely. I don't think we need to maintain a heavy footprint in Iraq to do that. Mindful especially of the fact that the Iraqi government really has been lukewarm in its embrace of Australia's contribution. And we've done it very much on the back of America's engagement in Iraq. So when we think about the future in Iraq for Australia, we need to be very mindful about what the United States are doing and also engage closely with New Zealand. After all, New Zealand has contributed very effectively with Australia in making contribution there. What we do there will obviously have an effect on New Zealand's posture as well.
The coalition aircraft, including Australia, of course, carried out thousands of attacks in support of the Iraqi and Kurdish ground forces, as you mentioned there. But it did come at a significant cost. Certainly as far as monitors claiming that perhaps thousands of civilians were killed in so-called collateral damage, if you like. Are there going to be ramifications from that, do you think?
Look, I think one thing we need to bear in mind is there is an information war going on as well. And while there are undoubtedly civilian casualties, relative to the operational tempo and the effort involved, this is a very, very small number compared to the scale of civilian casualties in previous conflicts. We now have extremely precise and low blast effect munitions that are deliberately designed to mitigate and minimise the consequences beyond the immediate target area. Now, part of the issue, though, of course, is, as we know, Daesh or ISIS has been actively positioning civilians in harm's way to make it difficult for the coalition to operate effectively, and then has been generating false and fake news, if you like, to reinforce their message about the West being excessive in its use of force. We have seen in this particular situation, in places like Mosul, a remarkably restrained use of force. One of the reasons why it took so long to push back on Daesh was simply because of the very deliberate and careful steps taken to slowly but surely wind back their military posture, their ability to strike at us and to mitigate the risk of hurting others. So that's actually something to be commended for. So when we hear stories like that, I think we need to be taking it with a grain of salt, mindful of just how absolutely dastardly Daesh was and has been, and its followers continue to be. We need to keep that in perspective.
Professor John Blaxland from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at ANU, thanks very much.
My pleasure, Andrew.